theft, smuggling, murder. These are just a few tools so shrewdly used by some of the world's wealthiest companies and individuals. Even worse, many would admit that, given the chance, they'd do it all again. This is Moonshine Diaries, and we're going to take a peek at some of those skeletons that have turned the average into the exceptional. Canadian Club Whiskey, one of Canada's greatest sources of pride when it comes to the world of alcoholic beverages. But the alcohol industry wasn't the only industry that they impacted. In fact, some would argue that the darker and more dangerous part they played changed both Canada and the United States forever.
The Prohibition era created characters like Nucky Johnson, the Real McCoy, and Al Capone. We all know who these men were. Just a few of the many infamous American gangsters during one of the most troubled times in the country's history. What if I told you that a small-town distiller out of southern Ontario was one of the most important figures in the revolution of American gangsters? Let's take it from the beginning. It was 1854 when granary owner Hiram Walker distilled his first barrel of whiskey. The only problem? He was an American, a native of Detroit, Michigan. And with the looming prohibition laws, starting a distillery there just didn't make sense. Prohibition was going to happen. It was only a matter of when. Investing his life's savings in a potentially illegal business wasn't something Hiram was about to do, at least not exactly. He had already begun to make his mark in the whiskey industry, being the first to store the liquor inside wooden barrels, giving it the distinct golden color and rich flavor. He was on the cusp of national success, but his dream was just too risky to pursue. He knew there was money to be made, but was it even possible? So he looked across the Detroit River to the unfamiliar country of Canada. What he saw was cheap land, a new home, and most of all, a way to cheat the law. Rather than give up his life's work, he sold the farm, so to speak, and his first Canadian distillery was established in Westernville, Ontario, Hiram Walker & Sons Limited. In those days, whiskey was produced without any type of branding. Call it ego or call it being a businessman, but Hiram wanted to make sure he got his name on every barrel. Because of this, his whiskey became widely popular in Waterville, then Ontario, and then all of Canada. Soon after, heads got turning down south of the border, and Hiram's whiskey made its way into the glasses of new American customers. Success grew rapidly, and it found a home in the finest of gentlemen's clubs, giving it its colloquial name, Club Whiskey. Eventually, the whiskey became so prevalent that it affected America's own bourbon sales, prompting the government to take action. They weren't happy sharing their piece of the alcoholic pie, no less than with an American turned Canadian. In an attempt to hamper the sales of club whiskey, the American government passed a law that stated that imported liquor had to bear the country of origin on its label. Well, Hiram did them one better. He put Canadian in the name, and Canadian Club Whiskey was born. Business exploded. Hiram bought even more land in southwestern Ontario and began building an entire community from the ground up. Homes, factories, police stations, his town eventually grew to a population of 600. He even paid for a clean water system and employed hundreds. You could say he was living the Canadian dream. But on January 16, 1920, this would all come to a crashing halt. The United States added the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, banning the production, transport, and sale of alcohol in America. It should have been a huge blow for Hiram, since the United States accounted for a large amount of his sales. And even worse, Canada passed laws that forbade public and hotel drinking. One by one, distilleries began to shut down. It was a disaster. Thousands were losing their jobs, and others were being locked up. Hiram should have felt sick to his stomach. He should have been, but he wasn't. He didn't even lose a blink of sleep. Nobody, only Hiram, saw that among all of the new laws, there was one gaping loophole. A loophole that would redirect the course of North American history, changing the lives of many people forever. Enter the most infamous American criminal of all time, Al Capone. Yes, him and his gang of rum runners became Canadian Club's top clients in the 20s and 30s and helped smuggle 75% of all the liquor brought into America at that time. Even though drinking laws were strict in Canada and outlawed in America, the Canadian laws said nothing about manufacturing and exporting. It was through this Windsor-Detroit passage that American gangsters took all of the risk bringing in a legal product, while Hiram Walker and Sons took none at all. Not many people today know about the role that Canada played in the revolution of American gangsters. People like Hiram Walker made a business partnership with one of the most dangerous men in American history, and he did it all simply to make a buck. Well, maybe just a bit more. While a case of Canadian Club would go for $15 in Quebec, American buyers would purchase a case for $120. Was Hiram Walker wrong for what he did? Or was he simply an opportunist? Who's to say? What we do know is that none of that matters, as Canadian Club whiskey will always be known as the unofficial whiskey of Prohibition.
It's no secret that history doesn't often swing in the favor of women. And if you flip through the history books, you'll come across millions of women who are subject to the brutal life of prostitution. But what if I told you that one of the most controversial figures in the history of prostitution was a woman herself?
Who put Seattle on the map? If you ask people today, the answer will more than likely be any of the major grunge bands of the early 90s. It was more than just music, it was a movement. And it put the sleepy community that eventually gave us Starbucks on the map. But Seattle has a reputation of being a gloomy place. Perhaps it has something to do with a seemingly endlessly parade of rainy days. Or maybe it has something to do with its haunting history. On June 6, 1889, parts of the downtown area burned to the ground. But instead of clearing away the charred remains, they just built over them. To this day, you can still take tours of the Seattle Underground. But when and how did Seattle recover from this disastrous event? Did the banks rally behind the people? Or was it thanks to the world's oldest profession? Enter Dorothea Georgine Emily Oben. Born in Germany in 1860, this young entrepreneur relocated to Seattle, Washington, 1 year before the tragic fire. Little did anyone know that she would eventually become one of the city's wealthiest people. Going by the name Lou Graham, she built her empire as a madam, running brothels that offered clients a sophisticated experience with attractive, intellectual women whose conversational skills were only surpassed by their special talents. And it is said that more city business was transacted at Lou's than at City Hall. In addition to her primary role as a high-class pimp, Lou got into the loan game, providing funds to people in the community. It's hard to say just how many families and businesses thrived thanks to the ill-gotten gains of Lou's prostitution ring, but entrepreneur and prominent Seattle banker Jacob Firth sent many of the town's elite to Lou with their loan requests. She happily obliged, of course, not to mention that her influence is believed to have saved Firth's Bank from ruin during the Panic of 1893. And for years to come, Lou's loans would deliver the city's most prestigious names from the brink of bankruptcy. So let's consider Lou for a moment. She built her empire by way of prostitution as Seattle's madam. She was a first-rate businesswoman, a landowner, an investor, and she had influence throughout the city. Upon her death in 1903, Lou was considered the richest woman in America at that time. Succumbing to syphilis, Lou died a childless spinster. All she left behind was a large fortune with nowhere to go, except back to Germany. It's been reported that Lou had a will requesting that her money be returned to her family back home. However, the people of Seattle believed that the supposed relatives in Germany were frauds. Or maybe they just didn't like the idea of all that money being sent far, far away from their grasping hands. Seattle ignored the will and kept the windfall. They used Lou's legacy to fund their public school system, and her buildings were donated to various organizations. When you think about it, the entire city of Seattle, and most of its respected families, owed their money and success, at least in part, to Seattle's madam, Lou Graham.
Hollywood actors are required to play all sorts of characters. Most of them pull from real-life experiences, but not all have a family history that's Oscar-worthy.
Money, drugs, war, love. All the perfect makings of a blockbuster hit movie.
Action!
But what if this particular story already exists? Not only as a movie, but in real life. And what if the star of the story isn't a certain Hollywood action star, but their parents? Our story begins with a 20-year-old Daolong Charles Fang, who in the eyes of his father lacked discipline. With the family's connections and Charles's martial arts skills, he was placed as a personal guard to General Gu of the Chinese National Revolutionary Army. But his job was short-lived. While standing guard in a meeting room, Charles's nervous fingers accidentally pulled the trigger on his rifle, causing him to drop the gun, unleashing a full round of bullets across the room. Though nobody was fatally injured, the damage had been done. Charles was let go. Embarrassed and dejected, Charles returned home, searching for work. Luckily, he got a job transporting Mitsubishi auto parts from China to Japan, and soon after, graduated to being the head worker. The job provided decent pay, but Charles was an opportunist. He headed a small group of workers that would take a portion of the car parts and sell them through the back door. Things were going well for Charles, until some Japanese co-workers reported him to the Japanese government. Sending him off to a Japanese prison, where each day he was forced to watch other prisoners be executed. But in 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out. Japan invaded China, raiding and destroying villages and lives. But in an unimaginable stroke of luck, Charles was let out of prison. The same connections that helped him get his prior security guard job pulled some strings, and he was released, alive. When he got back home, He once again got a job with the Nationalist Army, but this time, he would be a spy. Meanwhile, a widow named Li Chan left her 2 young daughters behind after the Japanese raided their village and escaped to Shanghai. Needing to make some quick money to survive, she heard that trafficking opium was a lucrative venture, so she took the risk upon herself and bought her first package from a cargo port. But in a turn for the worse, the port was being inspected for anything that would endanger the country. As fate would have it, the man who inspected Li was Charles. As he was about to arrest her, he noticed a beautiful blue flower in her hair. In those days, a white flower symbolized lost parents, but a blue one symbolized the loss of one's children. After listening to her story, Charles didn't see a criminal, but a mother trying to make enough money to one day return and provide for her children. So he gave her back the opium, and they said their goodbyes. Li didn't stop there and found great success as a drug trafficker, making a small fortune. This life of crime was coming easily for her, so she rolled the dice, searching for the jackpot in a life of illegal gambling. Her fortune grew, and at that point, she wasn't just the little villager she once was. Now, she was a well-known and highly respected figure in the Shanghai underworld with the moniker of Big Sister. Meanwhile, Charles took a wife and had 2 sons, but his job was getting dangerous. The Chinese communists were gaining power and looking to eliminate anybody working with the nationalists. In what could have been a fateful night, he was almost successfully assassinated, but was only shot in the leg. He was hobbled, but he managed to escape. Months later, he was the target of yet another attempt on his life, narrowly escaping with a bullet grazing his scalp. He finally quit his career when the Japanese raided his city. His wife fell ill and died. Fearing for his children's safety, he too left them behind, running off to the dangerous but lucrative Shanghai. Following in Li's footsteps, he turned to the dirty criminal world of the urban city for survival, quickly becoming the boss of a violent Shandong gang. Both being prominent figures in the criminal world, Charles and Li reconnected. Soon after, they fell in love and eventually had a son. But almost immediately after, Shanghai fell to the communists. And in fear of his own safety, Charles changed his name and, with all of their dirty money, moved to the safe city of Hong Kong and began to work honest jobs. Charles became a chef at the French embassy, and Li worked as a maid. But even then, Charles' past as a nationalist spy put him and his family in grave danger. Hong Kong just wasn't far enough. So he moved to Australia and worked for the embassy there. Li followed soon after. Once again, they were forced to leave behind their child, as they knew he would be in good hands with a trusted guardian, and without any affiliations to his criminal parents. This child grew up with intense martial arts training while receiving money from his estranged parents. This little boy would grow up to be Jackie Chan. For most of his life, he resented his mother and father for never being a part of his life. And it wasn't until 2005 that Charles finally decided he would tell him the full truth. All of the resentment and anger he had towards them was relinquished. He finally understood the whole picture and could find closure and forgive them. And although they both have passed away since then, Jackie will forever be grateful for the dark and crooked past they had to endure so that he could live a privileged life and become the worldwide superstar that he is today.
Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, Hh Holmes made a small fortune providing pharmaceutical aid to thousands of ailing customers. But it wasn't until his hanging in 1896 that his reign of terror was finally brought to light.
If you traveled to Chicago in the late 1800s and found yourself in need of medicine, there's a good chance you may have run into him. Meet H.H. Holmes, a handsome and charming man. At least charming enough to not only marry once, but 3 times. The problem is, he was still married to his previous 2 wives when he took his 3rd. And the witness at this 3rd wedding was, of course, his mistress. But perhaps looks and charm are necessary job requirements if you're going to spend your life conning people. Unfortunately for many of Holmes' victims, his ambitions ran much, much darker than run-of-the-mill bait and switch or bigamy. H.H. Holmes, the man dubbed America's first serial killer, operated a pharmacy on the 1st floor of his now infamous murder castle. The imposing structure, sitting at the corner of 63rd and Wallace, took up the entire block. Only 3 stories high, the mixed-use building consisted of shops, rooms that were rented out to travelers. And, of course, his torture chambers. With hidden passages and chutes leading to the basement. One must wonder, how did H.H. Holmes ever afford to create such a nightmarish building? Before he became a sadistic serial killer, he began developing his twisted skills as a con artist. While in medical school, Holmes would stage accidents with stolen cadavers and then collect on the insurance policies taken out in his fake family members. Combined with the art of buying products on credit, selling them, and then vanishing with the profits, Holmes plied his trade around the country, saving his swindled dollars the entire time. Eventually, he settled in the Chicago area, where he took a job working at a local drugstore owned by Dr. Elizabeth Holden and her husband, who was dying of cancer. Over the years, Holmes would pay Dr. Holden for ownership of the business, but after her husband finally died, she mysteriously disappeared. But not before she had signed over the business to him. Holmes was set, and he used his riches to buy up the rest of the property on the block, and hired various contractors to begin work on different areas of his eventual murder castle. In the end, there were over 100 rooms. Most of which were used and promoted as temporary living quarters for young, single women. A boarding house. It is unknown exactly how many people were murdered by Holmes. The remains of his victims didn't just reside within the walls of his castle, but as far away as Toronto, Canada. Holmes was only able to bring his dream house to life thanks to a number of diabolical money-making schemes. To pull off what he did, it took lots of money. Holmes used shady practices to make his horrific fortune. A fortune which allowed him to turn his demented dreams into a terrifying reality.
rich, the powerful, the wealthy. They really are no different from us. It's evident that it's not as simple as the money or the success, but it's the journey which one chooses. And while we all have skeletons in our closets, ours might just embarrass the family at Thanksgiving. Theirs have become the basis for 10 lifetimes of dirty money and tainted success. It begs the question, doesn't it? How would your life be different today if one of your ancestors had a dirty diary?